Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Jim. Austin may be joining us a little bit later. We'll have to wait and see. One of those things with doing things on the internet. Sometimes there's technical difficulties. I thought, my wife was talking to me the other night, and she said, she doesn't read the page at all. It's not her thing. She'd rather be reading a romance novel. But she asked me, she said, what's happening around the world? What has happened with the plague? Not the plague, but I guess it's a plague, but with the virus. Has it caused things to calm down? And I said, well, there's nothing real major going on. Everybody's still bickering here and there, but it's not like we've got any major efforts of war or anything like that. Everything's gone into sort of a downturn, right, Jim?
Yeah, I call it the plague of peace. There are two things going on here. One, in countries that have a lot of modern medical care, they know that the disease can increase the death rate among their population over the normal deaths. But in many countries, in Africa, Middle East, Asia, they haven't got the health care to begin with. And this frightens them. In fact, the only people in these countries who are doing anything to implement, countermeasures to avoid the spread of the virus are the upper crust, as it were, people in the cities. The government, they realize they're most vulnerable because they will get medical care no matter what the situation, and they don't want to die young and lose that, or die old in most cases. But in most of the world, and a lot of our wars are going on in obscure parts of the world. You don't hear about them much, but that's where most of the fighting and dying happens, like in Africa. In fact, Austin is doing an update on Sudan and Congo, and I imagine he'll have something to say about the impact of the virus on those two theaters of violence. But in many parts of the world, coronavirus will come and go, because unlike the Spanish flu, which mainly hit people in their prime, as it were, it was an unusual influenza. It was basically once you got it, the more vigorously your body fought back, the more intense the flu became. So it was a really nasty disease for that reason alone. And it probably will end up, in the end, as far as we can tell, it'll probably end up having a higher number of deaths, or death rate even, because the world population was smaller back then, than the coronavirus, because for most of the world, or a lot of the world, there's more medical care. Major countries like China, they have the resources. They produce most of the world's pharmaceuticals, and they're a police state. And despite the lying they've obviously been doing, they have managed to contain it because, they're a police state. They can do stuff like that. But in most of the world, at least half the world's population, there is no modern medicine. And if something like this comes through, a disease that affects mainly people who are very old, or mainly who are infirm to begin with, who are sick, who have a disease that could kill them, eventually or in the short term, and bingo, the coronavirus comes along and it arrives earlier. I expect even in the Western world, when how should I put it? When the thing is over, and you can compare it historically, looking at, for example, the United States, the government has always published, weekly deaths from all causes. And I was watching that, and I noticed that early on, in March. I think the latest data we have is the first week of April. They're always a little lagging, as it were. But the death rate, the national death rate, went down because the plague deaths, as were the virus deaths, are concentrated in a few areas, mainly New York City, not just New York State, but New York City urban areas. And most of the country, it's a minor thing. It's more of an inconvenience than a threat. But since a lot of people who are going to die in the next year or so anyway, because again, of incurable conditions, old age, cancer, you name it, that within 12, if you look at the deaths rate over, say, a 24-month period from the beginning of the plague hitting in January, you'll find there was a little bit of a peak, and then there was a decline, and you'll probably find that the total deaths per week are lower than usual or expected over the next 12, 18 months because people who were about to die died early. Now, in the rest of the world, this has enormous implications because eventually, when they keep hearing all this gloom and doom in the Western, the industrialized world, and they notice, well, nothing's happening around here. People are dying like they always do. They're old, they're sick, they die. What's the big deal? But the people who are worried about it are the rulers of those countries who know very well that they're marked, as it were, unless they take enormous precautions. So the only precautions that are being taken in most countries, no matter how poor they are, is in the capital, among the politicians and the industrialists, what have you. And so for most of the world's population, this the annual flu. We have the flu once a year. Have had it, for as long as anybody can remember. And the death rates vary. It'll go worldwide anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000. That's worldwide, and that's part of the background. In other words, it's in some years it's as bad as automobile accidents, but in most years it is not. So nobody gets excited about it. But when you have a pandemic, which this truly is, it's a different matter. But in most of the world, I mean, we monitor wars and civil disturbances, as it were, worldwide on a regular basis. There's nothing happening. I mean, people are undoubtedly dying of coronavirus. It is apparently spread to everywhere, but if it hits an area which normally has, a lot of deaths among, the elderly and the people who are very ill, they won't even notice it. I mean, unless doctors have the means to test, people who are deceased, like they found out in New York City, they found out, my God, we had thousands of additional deaths in nursing homes. Well, what was anybody thinking? I mean, this is a big scandal in New York City right now. People are yelling and screaming because the next of kin of a lot of these elderly people, they got word that their grandfather, their parent, whatever, was ill, but they couldn't visit because of the virus. At the same time, the state had not taken any extraordinary measures in the nursing homes, not just to protect the people living there, but the staff. Now, the staff are primarily young people in good health, and so there hasn't been a lot of death among them, but a lot of them have caught it. And as we discovered early on with the Diamond Princess cruise ship, situation where they tested everybody and they found out that 80% of the population never gets it. They might have antibodies indicating that it did, the coronavirus did try to get in, but their body just blew it away and developed what they're talking about now as herd immunity. In other words, once the a disease like this passes through an entire population and spreads widely, and this happened even with the Black Death. There are parts of Europe where it didn't hit during the first, outbreak, which killed a third of the population. But a century later, it would get into, obscure areas of Eastern Europe or what have you, or even in Western Europe, there were areas where they're just so remote, it never got. But it eventually caught up with them. But again, In this case, it's a silent killer, so to speak, or actually a stealthy killer. In many parts of the world, they're not even noticing it. But what it is doing is something similar to what happened with chemical weapons in World War One. I mean, this is something we've discussed before. Chemical weapons were widely used from 1915 on in World War One. And when the war was over, and they decided, and the Geneva Conventions were expanded to try and outlaw more things, the military did not make any big protest about outlawing chemical weapons. I mean, it was different, for example, with landmines. A lot of military commanders said, "Look, there is still, in many situations, there is a real need for this, like in Korea and a few other places." But with the chemical weapons, said, "Well, yeah, all right, we'll do the humanitarian thing, which is not something you expect out of those people," and that held ever since. The only time the chemical weapons were used was during Iran and Iraq on a large scale. That we saw all the World War One chemical weapons as well as nerve gas for the first time, and that was because it was the Middle East, but there was a religious element involved, and et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that this particular disease is not like the Spanish flu, where it hits people of military age. It hits people who are not of military, and people who are not eligible to be in the military. Anybody who's really sick, they're not going to take. These are the people that the coronavirus is hitting. So, I'm not trying to downplay the enormity of this real pandemic, the first one we've had in a century. And indeed, the prediction has always been that there'll be about one every 100 years. So this is our 100-year disaster. And overall, it's not as bad as it could have been. Because if you imagine for a moment, if the Spanish flu had occurred a year earlier, it could have had a serious impact on the outcome of World War One. Because historically, it actually began. I think it was first noticed in France in January of 1918. Now, this was a critical year in World War One because the Germans had defeated the Russians, and they'd moved most of their troops back to Europe, and they had special training and what have you, and they were going to have a victory offensive, which they almost won. The Americans showed up just in time. The Allies needed those extra troops, as it were, to prevent the Germans from breaking through. But if that had come a year earlier, the Germans were still, on their way towards knocking down the Russians, and Russia and Germany were one of the last places where the Spanish flu would have gotten to because of the war. It had a hard time crossing, battle lines, as it were. It would eventually gotten into Germany and Russia, but Russia was defeated at that point. The Germans were already moving their troops to the Western Front, and if that offensive either kicked off while the flu was going big time, which might not have happened, the Allies probably would have been at a bigger disadvantage. As it were, there were a lot of flu casualties in the Western armies, the French and the British especially, but not so much that it had a decisive effect. But a year earlier, it could have had a decisive effect. Now, that's very different from the coronavirus. It's forcing a lot of commanders to slow down operations. In other words, we've been noting, we get asked this a lot, well, what's happening with the coronavirus worldwide? Well, I says, it's sort of slowed things down. There is still fighting and dying going on, but it's mostly not up close and personal. That is, a lot of airstrikes, a lot of artillery, and in remote areas, there's still some terrorism of the sort, like with roadside bombs, planting landmines, things like that. But nobody's getting up close and personal and shooting people point blank and what have you, because they might get breathed on, before their victims die. So even ISIL, the Islamic State, distributed a warning a month ago to their membership, warning them to, basically stay away from other people until this blows over. Although I suspect that since then, I get hints, as it were, that they figured out how this thing works. and they are young, robust, warriors, can probably get away with being a little more audacious. But that hasn't happened yet, but it might. Um, but this does have an impact on warfare. In World War One, it did change the minds of the high command with the chemical weapons because the troops were terrified of it. And basically, they slowed down, they froze, despite all the urgings of their officers and NCOs. They just were not going to how should I put it, risk their mask coming loose or something like that while they're advancing through all this pea soup of poisonous gas. And so that the military was basically willing to let it be outlawed and basically enforce the ban ever since. But something like a virus that strikes the able-bodied, that would be a different thing. We may yet in another century, get an influenza like that. Hopefully by then medical science will advance to the point where they can stop it before it gets too far. But that's something people have to understand when they hear about comparisons between the Spanish flu and the coronavirus. They hit two different groups of people, and that has a tremendous impact on how it is perceived and how it actually changes. Wars and uprisings and what have you. For example, there's a lot fewer demonstrations in countries like, even in Iraq. They don't disappear. They still happen. But there's a disincentive because a lot of people, although they know as a fact that it mainly kills older people, they don't want to take the chance. So it does have a calming effect on a lot of the violence, which will undoubtedly pass in a few months, unless it comes back as flu's influences usually do. The Spanish flu kept bouncing back up for 2 years before it basically evolved into something less fatal. But the Black Death did not evolve into something more benign, and it kept coming back for several centuries, and it didn't completely go away until antibiotics were invented, in which case it became a minor nuisance because it was a bacterial infection, not a viral one. So disease does have an impact on history. And in fact, we're finding out more now about ancient plagues or pandemics. The measles was apparently the cause of the two great plagues in ancient Rome in the 2nd century and the 6th century. In the 6th century, it was in the Eastern Empire. But the scientific research has traced the measles back to an extinct species of wild cattle in Central Asia, of all places. But that gets back to the Chinese model. Ever since then, China has been the source of most of these pandemic, corona meaning a disease that's jumped from one species to another, which is always more virulent. I mean, any given time there are billions of viruses floating around, the environment, and most of them have no impact whatsoever. It's more like a random walk. Eventually, some of them are going to connect in a bad way, and you're going to have a epidemic or a pandemic disease. But as we know from our recent history, it happens very infrequently, and that's where the epidemiologists and scientists came up with the figure that a pandemic would arise about once a century. Again, mainly because nobody realized that until after the Spanish flu, that the source of most of these influenza, these corona type diseases, was coming out of China, because China for a long time had been the most populous country in the unified country in the world. There was a lot of people traveling, up and down the rivers or by horseback, back and forth with the imperial bureaucracy. And so if it broke out, it could easily spread. And eventually, as transportation got better worldwide, it spread around the world. Chinese do not like to admit this, And now they have a very active propaganda disinformation campaign saying, well, it's not us, it's not us, it's not us. But the science, is pretty much, nailed it down to China, not just in this particular case, but in the in historical cases. And so unless China is going to rewrite scientific history, which is difficult but not impossible,
Jim,
stuck with it.
Jim,
Yeah.
Jim, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Austin.
right.
Your turn.
No, I've been listening. No. Look, I've read in the past 2 months about 6 in-depth articles on the Spanish flu. And one of them, and this is, you said the Chinese cannot rewrite history. Understand that this is not proven. But there's Canadian evidence of a flu arising in 1917 in Western Canada. I mean, understand the Chinese had some the Canadians had some Asian workers, Chinese workers, come in to, among other things, work on the railroad and handle also movement of goods, shipping in Western Canada. And the thought is, by some of these epidemiological researchers, that a flu enters Western Canada and moves to Eastern Canada along the railroad. And one of the reasons that this is considered not outlandish is one of the first places that actually what we now call the Spanish flu shows up is actually in Kansas.
Yeah.
This is all right. Now, I'm not just sitting here, spinning conspiracy theories.
Well, that one's been disproved. Yeah, they basically, once they were able to sequence the surviving samples of the Spanish flu, which they got from graves, from odd graveyards, as it were. They basically say no, not there, but possibly somewhere in North America.
All right. To see, look, we're on the same beam. I was going to get to that. The disinterment. One of the other sources is on that. What's that Norwegian island, Svalbard? I believe it is. Yeah, that's where they pulled in. Some very well prepreserved, comparatively well preserved bodies of people who died of this particular epidemic. But point being made out of half of the 6 I've read is that traveling on troop ships and on troop trains. You were talking earlier when my mic wasn't working, when you were talking about, the subways have been a breeding ground for this in New York City. And I was thinking, that's the mention of troop trains, troop ships. And, we've had the de Gaulle, the French de Gaulle, the U.S. Theodore Roosevelt. There are really about 24 U.S. Navy ships that have had the coronavirus come up. You can't help but come in contact with other people. Yeah. When you're on a ship, it's impractical for everybody to wear hazmat. You can't be sailors in a combat ship.
Yes, now, and the air circulation systems make sure that the air is. That's why the Diamond Princess cruise ship was so critical, because the air. Exactly. The air filtration system was basically sending anything all over the ship.
Exactly. And as for this is not in disagreeing with you. This is just putting a different frame on your chemical weapons comparison. Let's use mustard, liquid mustard. It's not really a gas. Does that slow down the pace of operations, because you don't know where it is, and it's not what everybody compared to some of the other chemical agents that's poison gases that you could encounter. Here it's on the ground, fairly easy to avoid, but you got to be able to identify it. And in order to limit the physical damage, yes, of course, not inhaling it, but it burns your skin on this. You have to wear all essentially hazmat gear. And that World War I slow down the pace of operations. You fire mustard, and then you'd have this zone where nobody would want to walk through. And if you had a vehicle, of course, you'd have to do what? Decontaminate it so that it's not. And liquid mustard will remain active for a reasonable amount of time. As a matter of fact, trace elements were still showing up in the 90s and early 2000s on French World War I battlefields. So a farmer would get what would be a trace HD distilled mustard burn, and when tilling soil or digging a trench. The same thing goes on with this biological threat, because you've got to take and this is what you were pointing out. You've got to take precautions as you're going about your daily operational duties. Plus, the same thing applies in combat. Even though I was going to say, from what I can tell, the same level of chaos is continuing. Anarchic warfare is really a better way to describe it than that's something we've used in the past. In Eastern Congo, Central African Republic, and in Yemen, I realize the Saudi-led coalition, quote unquote, stood down operations for both diplomatic and health purposes, but it does not appear that that's really happened, particularly among the Houthis.
Exactly.
And I'm just bringing those up. It does seem like it's had an effect, and I'm saying it seems at a distance in Syria. And you're bringing up the Iraqi demonstrations. They're still going on.
Yeah, but not as intense as it were.
I'm wondering if they're properly. I have not seen any photos on it, folks. I'm wondering if they're socially distanced. I mean, it's really possible. Now, there was one other thing I was going to say. Picking up, actually, the person who I saw first came up with this was Dennis Prager. There's Tucker Carlson had a riff on it. And he didn't give Prager a credit for it, but it was about the concentration of cases in New York City, northeastern New Jersey, which is really a big, it's part of the greater New York City area. It was if 50% of the cases in the United States were in Montana, would you shut down New York? Which I read it, and I look, it was not satirical, but you couldn't help but snicker and laugh at the point Prager was making about the pizza pie, hopscotch nature of the outbreaks here in the United States. When I last looked yesterday, now it's probably changed excuse me, it was 2 days ago. We're doing this on a Friday, so I last looked at that Texas State Health Board dashboard. There were still 50 of Texas' 254 counties that had not had a single reported case. Now, admittedly, those are counties that are, a sixth the size of Pennsylvania or something like that. Maybe not quite that. The eighth the size of Pennsylvania, and they have 3,000 people living in them. So they are geographically distanced.
By lifestyle, they are quarantined.
Yes, well, exactly. It's hermit lifestyle. It's not really, but the deal is they're also off interstate. Well, no, they may have an interstate highway running through them, but unless they're running the local filling station or whatever, they're living on ranches and dispersed. You're with your family with the half dozen locals you may be employing or work on the ranch. Everybody knows everybody. And I'm not saying this is ideal. I'm just saying that is socially distanced, and they have had no reported cases. Most of the fatalities in Texas, and again, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I'm glancing at, occur within 12 counties. And say 14, but 12 counties. And I'll bet, even if you didn't know the counties' names, everybody in a listening audience in the United States, Canada, and Mexico would be able to name name the cities where they are, and you can do it right off the top of your head: Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, and to a lesser extent, now there are a couple of El Paso. Oddly enough, Lubbock County has had something of a breakout, but the 4 or 5 counties that really comprise Houston, the 4 or 5 counties that are Dallas, Fort Worth, those are your hot spots. And of course, what do you have there? Even though they're not relying on mass transit systems, Dallas has a very limited one. They have greater population density, and and yet Texas still has. I think it just broke 500 fatalities this week, so it's about 550, and that's out of 29.5 million people. No wonder when you look at New York City, subways, density, mass transit, and that's on the troop trains, on the troop ships. You're up next to other people, and in a place where, as you said, on a ship with the air system and the like, you're breathing the same air. You're within touching people, a place where you can. Can't avoid fluids in cases, and that's when people get sick. It's the same thing it was in 1917 or 1918 in that case.
Yeah, I'm looking at the United States data. Deaths and cases per million. New York is at 1,063 per million, the highest in the country, one of the highest in the world. Next is New Jersey, which again is connected by the rail network, the mass transportation network, and Connecticut. Those three are together amount to 2,000, most of the deaths in the country. And then you're right, it goes down there, Massachusetts, you got Boston, Louisiana, we had the Mardi Gras.
Mardi Gras did that. Mardi Gras did that.
Michigan, again, big cities. District of Columbia, a lot of ill politicians, and so on and so forth.
They also have the D.C. Metro is a very sophisticated subway system. And that connects.
But Texas, remember, New York, 1,063. Texas, 21 per million.
And you've got to look at populations of the states. And California is right at 40 million. Like I say, Texas 29.5, and then Florida's number 3. I forget how much it has. But with the exception of parts of the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, California has space. And especially the eastern part of the country, they've got something that not necessarily approaching the kind of geographic dispersion you have in Nevada or Texas, but they've got space. And
California is 39 per million.
See, it's down
twice what Texas is.
It's down. Yeah. It's down in a comparable. A comparable place. One of the things that I've thought about, and look, and say I thought about it, I also read something a couple of days ago, is that push on certain types of mass transportation. Do you really want to do that if it is a breeder of or an accelerator of disease? And we know it. We're getting another lesson that it's an accelerator. I didn't say a cause, but an accelerator or a magnifier. And it's a question worth asking when you're asked to put up $2 billion for a mass transit system in a city. I don't,
Well, hopefully the next time they'll realize that, in New York City, for example, the mass subway system is essential just to get the health workers and, the essential workers,
Sure.
the food stores to their jobs. But they did realize from the beginning that they could have basically run the same number of trains, but severely limited the number of people per car. And that was voted down for whatever reasons,
But that look, we say this in hindsight. We aren't the daily press at the daily briefing at the White House. Okay, so we're speaking in hindsight, though.
We're not that obnoxious.
No, Dan, you said it. I was going to say it looks like the ultimate reality show, except where do they find those actors who pretend to be members of the press? That they are so perfect at being obnoxious narcissists. I mean, the actors and actresses portraying the members of the press are just fabulous. Jim, I mean, what a comedy act. No. Look, the thing is that in hindsight, that would have been a brilliant decision on the part of the New York City mayor or mass transit. Especially if we're going to talk about essential workers, healthcare workers are essential. And I'd say sanitation workers and cops and firemen, all right? I mean, if anybody wants to disagree with that, then feel free. But in a situation like this, your medical people and your first responders are the most essential. They're more essential than Wall Street magnates by a long shot. Okay, let's let them travel and on the subways, disinfect the subways and be socially dispersed. But that, of course, I'm talking in hindsight. But that way, you need a mass transit system in New York City. I don't debate that. I've lived there. I lived in Manhattan 8 years. But at the same time, if we face a pandemic, that's the kind of decision on how to utilize the system. That's the decision that needs to be made.
Yeah. Well, something else they're realizing. At first, nobody was sure how different this was from the Spanish flu, because the Spanish flu, again, was frightening because it hit people in their prime. And it's only after the thing got into the West, where we had more honest epidemiology, medical statistics, we realized it was the younger people, healthier people, were largely immune. I mean, they weren't immune. They basically may have gotten it. They're doing this antibody testing now, and they're finding out that, as they did, back in February with the Diamond Princess, that 80% of the population, and that was a somewhat older population on the cruise ship, but not a lot of very sick people, because you had to have a certain level of health and mobility in order to get on a cruise ship, because you had to be able to get to a lifeboat, in order to take a cruise. But even there, 80%, got it, or had shown no impact whatsoever. Although now they're testing again, they're finding antibodies and what have you. But that is not unusual. But when you have a disease that mainly kills the elderly, you have to protect them. That's why in New York City, it's a big scandal now that nothing was done to provide extra protection for nursing homes, where they found an enormous number of deaths, many of them which weren't reported as coronavirus deaths, because they didn't test people who died while not under the care of coronavirus. But then they were able to, in many cases, that they had samples they could test and say, oh yeah, this poor woman had coronavirus. This is information. Hopefully, we did preserve a lot of the information we had from the pandemic of the Spanish flu. In fact, we've been studying that ever since. But it did not really apply with this one, because it basically turned upside down the people who were most liable to it. Again, I think the Spanish flu was really unique. I think most pandemic diseases like this, they'll hit everybody equally. But the coronavirus is is only really fatal if you already have a pre-existing condition. You're either overweight or you're either suffering from a chronic disease and what have you, which is going to eventually kill you. Those are the people who are going to, be pushed over the edge, as it were, by the coronavirus. Nobody really foresaw that. I don't think the Chinese even did, partially because, as they discovered early on, the how should I put it, the genetics of the population who got the coronavirus made a big difference, and they discovered this fairly early on by examining, lung, bodies and what have you. They found out that East Asians are much more susceptible to the coronavirus because the virus, there are more receptors in Chinese lungs, for no particular reason. But the genetic makeup of East Asian people's lungs is more receptive to the coronavirus, and that's what kills most people with the coronavirus. You basically suffocate.
Yeah,
in Africa, on the other side, and the other hand, they are the least. Their genetic composition in most Africans is least likely to allow the coronavirus into their lungs. So go figure. And also they found isolated populations in Europe and other places where when they did the analysis of the bodies of the lungs, they said, well, for some reason people in this part of Italy, go figure, have that genetic mutation, as it were, that basically makes them resistant to the coronavirus. Again, these are things you only find out in hindsight, but it is interesting insights, because the next pandemic will probably have the same effect. Different populations will have different levels of resistance to it, or vulnerability, as the case may be, and unfortunately, in this case, it was very stark compared to the Spanish flu, which hit the fit, which killed mostly people in their healthy and what have you, whereas this one is just quite the opposite. So you never know.
Well, I guess the one thing that we'll be doing as the summer comes on and makes its progress is we'll be looking to see what happens when the bad guys go back to work and get working again. So
I expect most of them, unless they're already sick, it'll have no impact, no noticeable impact.
Right. So we'll.
And that's what scares a lot of the politicians, because they love this crisis situation.
Right.
They can do all sorts of naughty stuff, get away with it.
Well, at least we'll have stuff to report on again this summer, and talk about maybe those hot spots will become hot again. Indeed. All right. Well, let's wrap this up, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.